The November frost had not yet lifted from the boardwalks of Blackwood when Irene Adler turned the corner onto Mill Street, carrying 38 pounds of salt-cured steer hide across her left shoulder. She walked with the long, measured stride of a person who knew precisely how much energy a mile required when carrying weight, her 5'11" frame cutting through the cold morning mist like a draft horse breaking trail. She wore 3 layers of coarse wool under a cracked grease-leather apron, the straps dug deep into the broad muscle of her shoulders. She was 28 years old, and for 10 of those years she had lived inside the sharp, bitter stench of tanbark, lime pits, and raw beef tallow. She pushed open the door of stone saddlery without knocking. The bell above the lintel gave a dull, rust-caked clink. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of pine shavings, beeswax, neatsfoot oil, and the dry, sweet dust of old leather. Marcus Stone sat behind his long oak cutting table, his back to the door. He was 52 years old, broad-backed and slow-moving, wearing a faded hickory-striped shirt with the sleeves rolled past his forearms. His right thumb was swollen at the joint, thick as a walnut, the skin over the knuckle purplish and tight with the autumn cold that always brought the rheumatism back into his hands. He did not turn around immediately. He finished driving a brass copper rivet through the strap end of a heavy trace harness, bringing the hammer down with the measured, rhythmic blow of a man who had struck the same iron 10,000 times before. He set the hammer on the anvil block, wiped his palms on his canvas apron, and turned to look at her. Irene did not offer a greeting. She shifted the bundle from her shoulder and let it drop onto the empty end of his cutting bench. The heavy leather hit the oak with a dead, thudding weight that rattled a box of brass buckles on the wall shelf. "Trade," Irene said. Her voice was low, flat, and stripped of ornamental polite nonsense, raspy from years of inhaling lime dust. 2 steer hides, vat-cured in oak and chestnut, salt-scraped and squared. I need 2 draft harnesses, heavy work, fitted for 1,200-pound horses. Buckles double-riveted, no iron fittings on the belly bands. Marcus did not answer right away. He stood up from his stool, his knee giving a dry pop in the quiet room. He walked over to the bench, his eyes moving over the top hide before his hands even touched the leather. He picked up the corner of the topmost skin, feeling the grain between his blunt, calloused fingers. His left hand moved over the hide with the automatic, silent inventory of a man who had spent 30 years calculating the life left in dead beef. "Who salted these?" Marcus asked. His voice had the dry, rasping texture of a hand saw going through dry pine. "I did," she said. 3 days in the brine, turned twice a day, drained on a pine rack. Marcus nodded once. He reached out, lifted the second hide, and turned it over to examine the flesh side. It was clean, pale cream, without a single knife mark or deep scorch from a careless skinner. He paused, looking at a finished bridle hanging from a wooden peg beside her shoulder. It was a piece he had finished 3 days ago, when his thumb had been swollen so bad he could barely pinch the awl. Irene reached out, her thick fingers catching the throat latch of the bridle. She did not ask permission. She took the bridle off the peg, brought it into the grey light coming through the front window, and bent the strap back on itself near the buckle turn back. She flexed it once, twice, listening to the grain. A faint, hairline fracture opened across the smooth top surface of the leather, white and powdery. She looked at Marcus. "Your tanning liquor was left too strong in the second pit, Mr. Stone. Oak bark was too rich, or you left it sitting 3 days too long while your hands were bad. It made the grain brittle near the turn. A heavy horse sets its neck against that underload, and it snaps before the first frost is out of the ground." Marcus looked at the hairline crack in the leather. He did not flinch, nor did he offer an excuse. He did not tell her that his thumb had been the size of a turnip that week, or that his apprentice had quit a month prior to dig for silver in Colorado, leaving him alone to mind the vats and the bench at 52. A younger man, or a prouder man, would have taken offense at a woman standing in his shop wearing a man's apron and telling him his leather was flawed. Marcus simply looked at the crack, took the bridle from her hand, and set it on the scrap heap under the bench. He looked at her hands. They were large, the nails cut square and short, the skin stained dark walnut around the cuticles from the tannin. Her knuckles were broad, her forearms corded with the dense, dry muscle that came from wringing out wet hides that weighed 70 pounds apiece. "The hides are good," Marcus said quietly. "The grain is tight. But I am 3 weeks behind on harness work. My thumbs don't close like they used to when the frost sets in." Irene stood her ground, her 5'11" frame filling the narrow space between the workbench and the harness racks. She looked around the shop with the same quiet arithmetic she used when grading hides at her father's yard. She saw 36 unfinished straps hanging from the rafters, a pile of untrimmed traces in the corner, and a ledger sitting open on the desk with 6 unbilled accounts scribbled in a shaky, pained hand. She calculated the work hours sitting in the room the same way she calculated the weight of salt needed for a 100-weight of hide. "You're losing 10% of your grain to improper soaking," she said, her eyes stopping on his soaking tub in the back corner. "The water's too hard, and you aren't scraping the bloom off the surface before you set your cut." Marcus looked at her. He looked at the road outside, where the wind was picking up dried dust and dead leaves, then back at the woman standing in front of him. He did not see a woman trying to be bold, nor did he see a girl lacking the delicate graces the town ladies displayed at the Sunday meeting house. He saw 40% extra output sitting right in front of him, wrapped in canvas and smelling of oak liquor. $4 a week, Marcus said. His voice was steady, unemotional, stating a fact like the price of nails. "You grade every hide that comes through that back door. You handle the pit liquor and the oil rubbing. You cut the traces. I do the hand stitching and the collar fitting. Work starts at 6. Irene looked at him. She looked at his swollen thumb, at the quiet, unbothered posture of his shoulders, and at the clean, orderly layout of his tools despite his failing hands. She had spent 28 years around men who yelled when they were tired and blamed their tools when their work went bad. Marcus Stone did not yell. He simply measured the work, accepted the flaw, and threw the bad piece under the bench. $4.50, Irene said. "And I use my own knives." Marcus reached out his broad, right hand. The skin was rough as coarse sandpaper. Irene took it in her own, her grip firm, thick-wristed, and cold from the morning air. They shook once, a single downstroke of physical agreement, and let go. No contract was signed, no promises were made, and neither of them smiled. By 6 o'clock the following morning, the arrangement had taken on the rigid, unyielding form of an iron hinge. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern ridge when Irene entered the back room of the saddlery. She did not call out. She removed her wool coat, hung it on the wooden peg beside the lime tub, and tied her heavy apron around her waist with 2 quick, automatic jerks of her hands. She found a broad pine plank, set it across 2 trestles by the north window where the light was best, and laid out her tools, 3 rounding knives, 2 bone folders, and a slate sharpening stone she had carried in her apron pocket for 8 years. Marcus was already at his bench. A lantern burned beside his elbow, casting a warm, yellow circle over a set of heavy draft collar pads he was stuffing with rice straw. He did not look up when she came in, but he had already set a tin cup of hot, black coffee on the edge of her trestle board. She picked up the cup, took 2 swallows of the boiling, bitter liquid, set it down, and went to work. For 4 hours, the shop contained no sound except the physical realities of their labor. There was the dry, hiss-lick sound of Irene's rounding knife pushing through 5mm steer hide, the wet thump of her mallet when she punched strap ends, and the rhythmic, metallic clink slide of Marcus's all punching through triple-ply leather, followed by the dry whisper of waxed flax thread being pulled tight through the hole. Marcus watched her from the side of his eye as he stitched. He watched her work with the specific efficiency of a person who had eliminated every unnecessary motion from her body years ago. When she reached for a hide, she did not lean or shuffle her feet. She used the leverage of her height, bending at the hips, her broad shoulders shifting beneath the canvas apron as she flipped a 50-pound skin as if it were a woolen blanket. When she sharpened her knife, she did not hurry. She laid the steel flat against the oil stone and drew it back at precisely 20 degrees, 8 strokes on the left, 8 strokes on the right, until the edge was keen enough to shave the hair off her forearm. He noticed the way she held her shoulders when she thought he wasn't looking. She stood tall, but there was a tightness around her shoulder blades, a rigid, defensive tension in her upper back. He knew why. He had heard the women down at the dry goods store talking over the bolt silk 6 months back when Irene had hauled her father's tallow barrels to the freight depot. They had spoken in those clipped, low-pitched tones reserved for small-town judgment, remarking on her size, her heavy boots, her lack of needlework, and how no man in the valley would ever want a bride who could out-hoist a deckhand. Irene had heard them too, Marcus knew. A person could not grow to 5'11" in a town of 5'4" women without learning to treat her own strength as an apology. Marcus looked back down at his work. He pulled the waxed thread home with a firm, sharp tug that seeded the knot deep into the groove. Idiots, he thought, the word passing through his mind with the cold finality of an accounting entry. The lot of them. A delicate woman with fine hands could not grate a side of heavy harness beef to save her life, and fine hands did not keep a shop running when the rheumatism set into the bone. He did not see an unwomanly frame. He saw 60 pounds of clean tensile strength and a mind that knew the precise difference between 3 weeks in the tanbark and 4. At noon, the sun hit the brass square on Marcus's desk. Without a word, Marcus laid his all down, stepped into the small back room, and returned with a loaf of hard-crust rye bread, a wedge of sharp yellow cheese, and 2 salt plums wrapped in a clean rag. He divided the bread down the middle with his pocket knife, cutting it cleanly on the oak bench, and set half on her end of the board. They ate standing up, looking out the front window at the street. The wind had brought a light, spitting snow, the first flakes of the season bouncing off the dry glass. Across the street, the town gossip, Mrs. Elspeth Gable, was walking toward the mercantile, her woolen shawl wrapped tight around her thin shoulders. She paused on the boardwalk, her eyes flicking across the street toward the saddlery window. She saw Irene standing tall beside Marcus, eating bread with hands stained grey from hide tallow, working in a man's shop on a Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Gable's lips pursed into a tight, thin line, her head jerking away as she hurried into the store. Irene saw it. Her jaw tightened slightly, a small, involuntary muscle twitching beside her ear. She dropped her gaze to the floorboards, her posture instantly stiffening into that familiar, guarded stance. Marcus took a bite of his cheese, chewed it slowly, and swallowed. He did not look at Mrs. Gable, nor did he offer a comforting phrase that would have sounded hollow in the cold room. "The wind's coming out of the north," Marcus said, his voice flat and practical. "We'll need to move the lard oil tubs closer to the stove tonight or the grease will seize up before morning." Irene looked up at him. She caught his eye. Marcus held her gaze for 3 long seconds, not with romance, not with pity, but with the steady, unyielding gravity of an anchor dragging on river gravel. His eyes told her what his mouth would not, that the opinion of Elspeth Gable did not alter the weight of leather, did not pay the freight bill, and did not matter inside the 4 walls of stone saddlery. "They'll freeze by 8 if we don't bring them in," Irene said, her voice steadying. "Then we bring them in at 5, Marcus said. He turned back to his bench, picked up his awl, and rubbed a lump of beeswax along his thread. The rhythm resumed instantly, the scrape of her knife, the click of his punch, the slow, steady tick of the brass clock on the wall. They worked side by side through the fading afternoon light. 2 people who had tallied their lives up to that point, found a deep deficit of help, and silently agreed that the arithmetic had finally balanced out. By the first week of December, the frost had driven deep into the clay roads around Blackwood, turning the wagon ruts into iron-hard ridges that rattled the teeth of anyone driving a team. In the back of the shop, the lard oil tub sat 2 feet from the cast-iron stove, keeping the tallow soft enough to work into the dry grain. Irene had settled into the rhythm of the place with a quiet, unhurried precision. She knew without looking where Marcus kept his heavy punches, how many turns of wax thread he preferred on a heavy collar strap, and exactly when his right thumb was throbbing too fiercely for him to manage the small buckle rivets. The friction arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of Thaddeus Vance, who stepped into the saddlery wearing a tailored beaverskin coat that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and damp wool. He did not wipe his boots at the sill. He walked directly to the center of the floor, his silver-topped cane clicking rhythmically against the pine boards. He was a small, slick-faced man who represented the Mercer Syndicate, an investment firm out of St. Louis that had spent the last 3 months quietly buying up every local resource that kept the county running. Marcus did not rise from his stool. "Stone," Vance said, his voice smooth and thin as lard grease on warm iron. "I'll save us both the chilly air. The syndicate has finalized the purchase of the oak bark mills down at Miller's Creek, along with the rendered tallow stocks at the slaughterhouse. Every cord of bark and every tub of grease in this valley runs through my desk starting Monday." Marcus pulled his thread tight. "Is that so?" "It is," Vance replied, resting his hands on his cane. "Small shops can't compete with central purchasing, Marcus. You're 52, your joints are stiff, and you're running behind on your orders. The syndicate is offering you $400 cash for the shop, the tools, and the goodwill. You can stay on as a salaried benchman if you like, or you can take your money and retire to a warmer climate." Irene stepped out from the back room, a rounding knife balanced casually across a palm. She stood at her full 5'11", her broad shoulders filling the doorway, her apron stained dark with tannin. Vance glanced at her, his lips curling into a faint, dismissive sneer that moved over her heavy boots and grease-stained hands. "And I suppose you'll be needing a new arrangement for your help," Vance added, gesturing toward Irene with the tip of his cane. "The syndicate doesn't employ women in the leather trades. It isn't proper, and it doesn't look right to the board." Marcus set his awl on the bench. He turned his head slowly, his grey eyes leveling on Vance with the absolute stillness of a granite boulder. He looked at Vance's polished boots, then at the silver cane, and finally straight into the man's eyes. "The shop isn't for sale, Vance," Marcus said flatly. "And my help is none of your concern. Get out of my doorway. You're letting the cold in." Vance's smile vanished, leaving his face flat and hard. "You won't have oak bark to tan a rabbit skin by spring, Stone. You'll be out of stock in 30 days. He turned on his heel and stepped out into the wind, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass panes. The threat was not an empty one. Within 48 hours, the town began to shift its weight. The women at the general store turned their backs when Irene stepped up to the counter for salt, whispering loudly about an unmarried woman spending 12 hours a day in a widower's shop while the syndicate promised new jobs and cheap harness goods for the whole county. The local draymen, nervous about their own credit with Vance's grain mills, stopped dropping off small repair work. The air in Blackwood grew sharp with the quiet hostility of a town deciding which side of a balance sheet it wanted to be on. Irene said nothing about the whispering, but Marcus saw the way she worked through the long, freezing evenings. She bent over her trestle board for 10 hours at a time, her posture growing rigid as she tried to force her tall frame down to match the height of a bench designed for a man 5 inches shorter. By 7 o'clock every night, her lower back was so stiff she had to press her hand into her spine to stand up straight, her knuckles white with the effort of hiding the pain. Marcus said nothing to her that evening. He waited until she put her coat on and left for her father's small house at the edge of town. As soon as the bolt dropped shut, Marcus pulled a lantern over to his wood pile. For 3 consecutive nights, long after the town had gone dark and his thumb joints burned like raw iron in the frost, Marcus worked in the coal shop. He took 2 heavy timbers of cured black walnut he had saved for 10 years, planes them down by hand, and cut clean, deep mortise and tenon joints. He worked slowly, taking precise measurements from the floor to the exact height where Irene's elbows rested when she held a skin. He built a work stool 4 inches taller than standard, with a broad, dished seat contoured to support a long torso, reinforced with double iron stretchers at the base to hold heavy weight. Alongside it, he took a heavy sheet of duck canvas and 2 panels of soft, oil-cured calfskin. Using his finest needle and double-wax thread, he hand-stitched a custom work apron, broad across the chest, tailored with deep shoulder gussets that gave full movement to her muscular arms, and padded at the hip bones with thick felt where heavy hides usually bruised her legs. On Monday morning, Irene walked into the shop at 5:30. The air was frigid, the frost thick on the inside of the glass. On her trestle board sat the walnut stool, polished smooth with beeswax, and the custom leather apron laid out neat and square. Irene stopped. She looked at the stool. She reached out and touched the dished seat, her thumb running over the smooth, hand-planed curve of the walnut. She picked up the apron, turning it over to examine the stitching. It was clean, tight, and exact, stitched with 6-ply thread that would hold up to 10 years of heavy labor. She looked at the shoulder gussets, designed specifically for a broad-shouldered frame that every other person in town treated as a defect. She looked across the room at Marcus. He was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of glue, his back turned to her as if nothing unusual had happened. "It's walnut," Marcus said, his voice gruff and low, not looking around. The old stool was too low. "You were leaning over your work. Bad posture ruins a knife stroke." Irene did not say thank you. She put her coat on the peg, slipped her arms through the broad straps of the new apron, and adjusted the buckled harness across her back. It fit as if it had been grown on her. She sat down on the high walnut stool. Her spine aligned perfectly, her elbows rested on the pine board at a clean 90-degree angle, completely eliminating the strain in her lower back. She picked up her rounding knife, caught Marcus's eye as he turned from the stove, and held his gaze. There was no softness in her expression, but there was a deep, unshakable clarity, a mutual recognition that they were 2 parts of a single, well-oiled machine, and that neither of them was going to be broken by a speculator from SD. Louis. "Now, my friends, isn't that just like a real man who shows his heart through his hands instead of cheap words?" Marcus didn't buy her flowers that'd wither in a day. He built her something to ease her heavy burden. If you're enjoying this story of honest labor and quiet devotion, Take a quick moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below letting me know what you think of Irene and Marcus so far. It truly helps our little corner of the frontier grow. By the middle of December, the syndicate's blockade tightened its grip. Vance had locked down every barrel of oak bark extract within 40 miles, forcing the local tanneries to shut their vats. Marcus's supply of vegetable tan harness leather was down to 4 sides, barely enough to finish 3 sets of light buggy harness, let alone the massive military contract for 200 artillery sets that the United States Cavalry Depot was putting out for bid in January. The cavalry contract was the town's main economic engine for the winter. The officer in charge, Major Thomas Vance, no relation to Thaddeus, but a rigid, practical military man nonetheless, had announced that the depot would test sample harnesses under a 2,000-pound deadweight pull at the town square before awarding the contract. Thaddeus Vance had already secured the syndicate's position, bringing in 3 wagon loads of cheap, central tan hides from Illinois to build their sample sets. But Irene knew those hides. She had inspected a strap dropped from one of the syndicate wagons outside the tavern. They used hot acid to speed the bath, Irene said that evening, sitting on her high walnut stool while Marcus rubbed oil into a bridle bit. It cooks the outer fibers while the core stays raw. It looks thick and dark on the surface, but under a sudden snap, the inside fibers shear like rotten straw. We don't have the bark to tan our own, Marcus said, setting his oil rag down. And we don't have 30 days to let a standard vat set. Irene leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. The yellow light of the oil lamp caught the strong, square lines of her jaw and the clear, intelligent focus of her grey eyes. We don't need oak bark, Irene said. Marcus looked at her. There isn't a saddler in the state who tans without vegetable bark. They're as if they know chemistry, Irene replied, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of a master craftsman. My grandfather was a tanner in Pennsylvania before the bark runs were cut out. He used a mineral bath, chromium salts and alum, paired with heavy rendered lard oil and bone fat worked in by hand under low heat. It doesn't brown the leather, it turns it a pale, greyish blue. But it locks the hide fibers into a tight, cross-grained web that won't absorb water, won't freeze brittle, and holds twice the tensile strength of 3-month bark leather. Marcus listened. He did not question her authority, nor did he offer the traditional male skepticism that had met every technical idea Irene had ever voiced in her father's yard. He calculated the variables in his head, 20 days until the depot test, for tubs of alum available at the dry goods store, 50 pounds of lard oil in the back room, and the hyper-competent mind of the woman sitting across from him. How much salt do we need? Marcus asked. Irene let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing by an inch. 200 pounds. And we'll have to work 12 hours a day in the back pit to scrape and drum the hides before the solution sets. Then we start tonight, Marcus said. For the next 3 weeks, Stone's saddlery operated like a night forge. While the rest of Blackwood slept under heavy quilts, light flickered through the back windows of the shop until 3 in the morning. Together, Marcus and Irene hauled 100-pound steer hides from the salt piles to the mineral vats. They stood shoulder to shoulder over the steamy alum baths, their breath rising in white clouds in the freezing air, their arms working in heavy, rhythmic unison as they turned, scraped, and worked the hides with broad wooden paddles. The work was brutal, back-breaking labor that left their hands raw and their muscle tissue burning with exhaustion. Yet there was no friction between them, only a seamless, unspoken division of energy. When Marcus's thumbs cramped so hard his fingers locked into a fist, Irene silently took the heavy iron flesh scraper from his grip and finished the hide without a word. When Irene's frame shook with fatigue after 6 hours of drumming leather, Marcus was there with a hot cup of strong coffee and a thick slice of salt beef, holding her heavy wool coat open so she could slip her arms into the sleeves without reaching. One night, near 2 in the morning, they stood together by the back stove while a fresh batch of blue-toned trace leather dried on the racks above. The air smelled sharp of alum and sweet lard oil. Irene was leaning back against the pine workbench, her tall frame relaxed, her face flushed red from the heat of the stove. Marcus reached up to adjust a strap on the drying rack above her head. As he pulled the leather tight, his broad forearm brushed against her shoulder. He stopped. He was inches from her face. In the quiet, dimly lit shop, with the snow beating softly against the window panes, the 24-year age gap between them seemed to evaporate into the simple, physical truth of who they were. Marcus looked into her eyes. He saw no fear in her, no shyness, and no desire for him to hide his age or his worn, calloused hands. Irene looked back at him, her gaze resting on the deep lines around his eyes and the broad, quiet strength of his face. She did not lower her eyes as she did with the townspeople. She held his gaze with a steady, unyielding clarity that communicated everything their mouths were too practical to say. "It's going to hold," Irene whispered, her voice soft in the quiet room. Marcus did not break eye contact. "It's going to hold," he agreed, his voice a low vibration in his chest. "Because you made it." He stepped back slowly, took his apron off, and hung it on the peg. They had made their calculation. The variables were accounted for, the work was done, and when the cold morning came, they were ready to stand their ground against whatever the town or the syndicate had to offer. The morning of the military depot pull test brought a biting, blue sky cold that turned every breath into a plume of white steam across the Blackwood town square. A crowd of 50 townspeople had gathered near the hitching rails, shivering in their heavy wool coats and thick shawls, whispering among themselves as 2 massive 3-ton freight wagons loaded with iron pig ingots were hauled into place by 4-horse teams. Major Thomas Vance stood on the courthouse steps in his brass-buttoned blue dress coat, his pocket watch open in his gloved palm, flanked by 2 armed cavalry sergeants. Thaddeus Vance was already there, standing beside a long pine sawhorse that held the syndicate's entry. 2 full sets of dark, glossy brown artillery trace harnesses, rubbed with shoe polish until they gleamed like fresh mahogany. He wore his beaverskin coat, his hands resting lightly on his silver-topped cane, exuding the calm, victorious air of a man who believed money could purchase the physical laws of nature. When Marcus and Irene arrived, pulling a handcart through the rutted frost, a low murmur rippled through the onlookers. Irene walked on the left, wearing her broad canvas and leather apron over her wool coat, her 5'11" frame moving with unhurried, powerful grace. On the cart lay their entry, heavy artillery harnesses crafted from the blue-grey, mineral-tanned leather. They were unpolished, pale, and stripped of ornamental brass, looking utilitarian, cold, and strangely alien next to the dark beauty of the syndicate's gear. "Mrs." Elspeth Gable stepped back toward the dry goods porch, nudging the baker's wife. "Look at them," she muttered, loud enough to carry across the quiet square. "Brought his woman along to haul his loads. Like a pair of oxen in a yoke." Irene did not look at her. She kept her eyes on the heavy iron test frame anchored to the town hitching post. Marcus stepped to the cart, his face an unreadable mask of weathered oak, his broad hands lifting the first blue trace strap to hand it to the cavalry sergeant. Thaddeus Vance stepped forward, stepping between the sergeants and the cart, a contemptuous sneer playing on his thin lips. "Major," Vance called out, turning toward the courthouse steps. "Are we truly allowing street-side artisans and unwomanly yard laborers to submit unapproved, grey-skinned offal for a United States cavalry contract? This shop hasn't bought a cord of bark or a gallon of approved tallow in a month. That leather is raw, UN tanned, and dangerous to our troops." Major Vance looked down from the steps, his sharp eyes moving from Thaddeus to Marcus, then resting on Irene. He noticed the precision with which the harness straps were rolled, the clean alignment of the copper rivets, and the heavy, double-stitched turnbacks near the buckle tongues. "The specifications call for a 2,000-pound static pull, Mr. Vance," the major said flatly. "The army does not care what color the leather is, so long as it holds the weight. Hook up the syndicate's entry first." 2 cavalrymen took the syndicate's glossy harness, buckled it around the iron test frame, and hooked the main trace chain to the weighted freight wagon. The wagon driver whipped his team. The 4 draft horses leaned into their collars, the heavy iron chain snapped taut with a metallic ringing sound, and the 2-ton wagon shuddered forward 6 inches. Then came a sound like a rifle shot. The main belly band strap of the syndicate harness exploded near the buckle turn back. The glossy dark leather sheared in 2, revealing a dry, crumbly white core where the hot acid bath had cooked the inner fibers. The heavy wagon slammed back into its chocks with a bone-jarring thud. The draft horses reared, and the crowd gasped, stepping back hastily. Thaddeus Vance turned pale, stepping toward the broken strap. "A fluke. A bad hide. We have 10 more sets in the wagon. The test is single elimination, Mr. Vance," Major Vance said calmly. He gestured toward Marcus's cart. "Put Stone's entry on the frame." Irene did not wait for the soldiers. She lifted the heavy blue-grey harness herself, her broad shoulders working in clean, effortless rhythm as she fitted the collar and buckled the belly band around the iron test rig. She did not use a punch or a hammer to force the tongue through. Her hands moved with the swift, practiced dexterity of a master hide grader who knew the exact yield of every inch of hide. She stepped back beside Marcus, her shoulder lightly brushing his sleeve. "Hook the second wagon behind the first," Major Vance ordered the sergeants. "Let's see what this mineral bath is worth. 3,000 pounds. The driver cracked his whip. The 4 draft horses dug their shoes into the frozen mud, their muscles straining, steam blasting from their nostrils. The iron chain yanked taut with a force that shook the hitching post in its stone footing. The 2 freight wagons, carrying 6,000 pounds of solid pig iron, slowly groaned forward out of the frozen ruts. The blue-grey leather stretched an eighth of an inch, locked its cross-grained fibers together, and held. The buckled tongues bit into the leather without tearing a single grain. The harness did not groan, did not crack, and did not fail. The wagons moved 10 feet down the square before the Major held up his hand. "Hold!" Major Vance shouted. Silence fell over the square, save for the hard panting of the draft team. The Major walked down the steps, knelt in the mud, and ran his gloved hand over the blue-grey strap under full strain. He stood up, looked at Thaddeus Vance, whose mouth was working wordlessly, and then turned to Marcus and Irene. 200 artillery sets, Major Vance said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent town. Delivery by March 15th. $10 a set. 10% advance paid today from the depot quartermaster. A quiet gasp ran through the townspeople. $2,000, with another $1,000 upon completion, was more money than any independent shop in the valley had seen in 5 years. Thaddeus Vance took a step forward, his face dark with rage. "Major, this is absurd. You are awarding a federal contract to a broken-down old man who can barely use his thumbs and a giant of a woman who belongs in a circus." Marcus took one step forward. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood at his full height, his broad chest blocking Vance's view of Irene, his grey eyes cold as river ice. "She built the leather, Vance," Marcus said, his voice low, steady, and terrifying in its absolute restraint. "Her mind saved the contract, her hands did the labor, and her name goes on the ledger. If you have another word to say about her, you can say it to me behind the shop." Vance looked at Marcus's thick, calloused hands, looked at the crowd, which had suddenly gone dead quiet, watching the speculator with cold disapproval, and stepped back. He turned without a word, climbed into his buggy, and whipped his horse down the road out of Blackwood, leaving the syndicate's broken, polished leather lying in the mud. That evening, the saddlery was quiet again. The front door was bolted against the howling December wind that rattled the glass panes. A single lamp burned on the desk in the corner, casting a long, amber glow across the cutting bench and the high walnut stool. Marcus sat at his desk. For the first time in weeks, he did not have an awl or a strap in his hand. Before him lay the heavy leather-bound shop ledger, open to the first blank page of the new year. Beside it sat a small velvet box he had retrieved from his tin strongbox in the back room. Irene walked out from the back room, her coat already on, her canvas apron neatly folded over her arm. She stopped near the desk, looking at him. "The vats are drained," she said quietly. "The alum is set for tomorrow morning. We can cut 50 traces by noon if the light holds." Marcus looked up at her. He did not stand. He turned the ledger toward her. "I've been doing the arithmetic of this place, Irene," Marcus said. His voice was soft, stripped of all formality, carrying the weight of 52 years of quiet observation. "Before you walked through that door 4 weeks ago carrying those salt hides, this shop was running a heavy deficit. I was counting my years down, looking at my hands, and calculating how long before I had to lock the door for good. I measured the distance between 52 and 28, and I thought the math said I had no right to ask anything of you." Irene stood still, her heart beating a steady, heavy thud against her ribs. She did not look away. "I was wrong about the math," Marcus continued, reaching out to touch the open ledger page. "A shop doesn't run on years. It runs on competence, on shared labor, and on 2 people looking at the same piece of leather and seeing the truth of it. You brought stability to the balance sheet, Irene. You brought life back into these walls." He reached into the velvet box and pulled out a simple, thick band of unadorned silver, polished smooth, forged broad enough to fit her working hand. Beside it, he laid a new legal document he had drawn up at the lawyer's office 3 days prior. "This is a deed of equal partnership," Marcus said, his eyes meeting hers with absolute, unshakable devotion. 50% of the shop, the tools, the contract, and the land. And if you'll have me. The same balance in my home and my life. No fine speeches. Just our honest partnership for as long as we both have breath to work. Irene looked at the ledger. She saw her name written in Marcus's precise, shaky script alongside his own, Stone and Adler, saddlers. She looked at the silver band. It was not. She stepped closer to the desk. She did not cry. She reached down, picked up the silver ring, and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, resting against her calloused knuckle as if it had always belonged there. She reached out and placed her hand over his swollen, aching thumb, her warm, strong fingers closing around his hand with a firm, protective weight. "The ledger balances, Marcus," Irene said, her voice rich and steady in the warm room. "It balances completely." They held each other's gaze in the quiet shop, two broad-shouldered, quiet people who had found their match not through grand words or romantic promises, but through the hard, beautiful reality of shared work and mutual respect. They were married the following Tuesday at 9 o'clock in the morning in the magistrate's quiet back office, wearing their clean Sunday wools. There were no flowers, no bridesmaids, and no church bells. They signed the register with the same steady ink they used for their business receipts, walked back down Mill Street together through the crisp morning snow, and opened the shop by 10. Over the next 20 years, Stone and Adler became the premier harness and leather enterprise in the entire territory. They built a large, bright workshop behind the old building, hiring 6 young apprentices, both young men and capable young women whom Irene trained with patient, exacting discipline. The town of Blackwood learned to respect the tall, quiet woman who ran the finest tanner's bench in the state, and the whispers at the general store faded into distant, forgotten history. Their home life was filled with a deep, quiet peace. They built a small timber house on the ridge above town, where the north wind blew clean and dry. In the evenings, after 10 hours at the bench, they sat together by the stone fireplace, Marcus oiling his tools on his side of the hearth, Irene reading the market reports on hers, sharing a single pot of hot tea in the quiet warmth of a home built on steadfast devotion. And so, Marcus and Irene prove that a bond built on mutual respect, honest labor, and steadfast devotion will always outlast the grandest words and hardest storms. May you find that same quiet strength in your own lives, dear listeners. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. May God bless you and keep you safe on your journey until we gather round the fire again next time. Take care, friends.